Last time we just looked at some very early work, and I talked about the fact that Chinese history is sort of alternating between periods where there's a strong united empire with periods where kind of all falls apart. And where we just left the Han Dynasty, like the first golden age that really kind of established a lot of things that are going to continue in the imperial system. But after that, we fall into, several hundred years of what's called the period of disunity. Sometimes it's called the period of six dynasties, where everything breaks down into different political entities. And these are often, these sort of periods of chaos are often times when there's a lot of good things happen. These are usually good periods for the development of philosophies and religions. They tend to be really good periods for art as well. Art, philosophy, literature, they don't necessarily come out of a great time of peace. They often come out of times of chaos, particularly developments in religion and philosophy, because people are turning to ideas, which they don't necessarily turn to when everything is going well. So we're talking about a period of a lot of civil wars when the dynasty collapsed. It's a real spread of Buddhism. We know that Buddhism had entered China earlier, but this is where it begins to be absorbed within Chinese culture. And we have the first works of art. And when, as we saw last time, Buddhism begins to merge with Daoism and Confucianism and sort of form this triad of beliefs that work together. Buddhism enters China from the northwest. It comes in along the northern Silk Road, and I'm not sure why, but the north is where a lot of ideas enter China, even though the capital is further south. And one of the things that comes and first appears is the building of these cave sites. Now, I'm talking about monks and nuns from India who have traveled along the Silk Road, entered China, and brought ideas of Mahayana Buddhism, but they also brought traditions from India, such as the sacredness of caves as sites particularly for Buddhist monks, and also things they'd seen like the great Bamiyan Buddha in Afghanistan, the great 120-foot Buddha figure that was destroyed. And so a tradition develops in India of building these cave sites along rivers. But a new tradition begins, and that is that the sites would have at least one gigantic figure of a Buddha. That was not something we saw in India. It's a new concept. It sort of combines what we saw in Afghanistan of the giant Buddha along with the Indian cave tradition. And one of the very earliest sites is at the Yungan Caves. This is in the north. Yungan means cloud ridge. It's the name that was applied. It is along a river. And there are a great many caves, some large enough to enter. Many are just niches in the wall with a little figure in the niche, and it's still considered a cave. And we're seeing from the side here, the large figure, that's what we're going to look at, is the colossal Buddha. Dates from around 460. And this is the earliest large-scale Buddha figure in China, known as the colossal Buddha. It's in an Indian style. Now, this would have been commissioned and paid for by whoever the ruling family were at the time. They would have commissioned it. It would have been overseen by the monks and the nuns. So this is going to have strong connections to India. And because it's early, it isn't really a developed Chinese style. It's very generic in many ways. Its primary influence is India. In fact, people at the time commented on the fact that he was wearing foreign clothes. So the idea of the simple Sangati, or the monk's robe from India, still looked foreign in China, and they would have recognized that in the figure itself. Of course, reminding you of the great Bamiyan Buddha, which itself was fairly generic as a style. It's hard to put a lot of style in something that big. You're lucky if you can make it look naturalistic at all. in this case, we have now a motif that developed in India that's going to continue, and that is the triad group. In other words, a seated figure of Buddha in the center, usually Shakyamuni Buddha or one of the transcendent Buddhas, a Buddha in the center, with two flanking attendants. They're usually referred to as attendants, two bodhisattva attendants on each side. Now, this isn't how you would have originally seen this. Let me back this up a second and look at it from the side again. When you look at it from the side, you can see that it's really a relief sculpture. In other words, it's a sculpture carved back into a flat surface. But originally, this stone wall continued down the front. This wasn't originally open at all. It was a thin stone wall down the front, and then there were two entrances, one on each side. So it really was more like in a cave. So you would go in one of the side entrances, and then you'd be in this massive dark cave chamber with this huge figure of Buddha inside. However, over time, earthquakes and other things, that thin surface collapsed. And when it collapsed, it took out one of the bodhisattvas. You can see there, his feet are still here on the left, but the figure is gone because the wall collapsed on it and destroyed that figure. So it really would have looked quite different. It would have been very dark and very moody and mysterious, the way you would have seen it. Now that it's completely open, of course, it's much less so. On the walls in the back, there are carved many, many, many small Buddha figures. And this actually comes from one of the sutras or one of the teachings of the Buddha. It's a story in which, for whatever reason, it's called the miracle at Shravasti. It doesn't matter what it's called, but the Buddha replicated his body 100 times. So that tradition of 100 small little Buddhas, and you see this everywhere in architecture and art, lots of little tiny figures. If you wonder why are there all these tiny figures, that's why. It really all goes back to this one story, even if people don't remember why that it got started that way. That is how it got started. We see the traditional characteristics as we would expect from India, the Ushnisha, the Urna, the long elongated earlobes. He's sitting in meditation mudra or dhyana mudra with left hand down and right hand on top of it. That is the traditional mudra for meditation. And the bodhisattvas probably were both in the same mudra. That's the fear not with the hand out as the form. So an early example, not much of a developed style yet, nonetheless, the beginning. The face, very simple, very sort of stylized, very minimal face. Another cave on that site has a figure that's from about 100 years later it's also a large figure, but not quite as large, a seated figure. This is a depiction of Maitreya Buddha, or Maitreya sometimes is called a bodhisattva, but really a Buddha. And he is generally seated like this. You never see a Buddha or a bodhisattva seated like this, as if they're seated on a stool or a chair in a very Western way. They're either cross-legged, sitting on like a lotus blossom. When you see a figure sitting like in a chair, that's going to be Maitreya. And I honestly don't know the story of why that is. I only know that it is. Maitreya is considered the Buddha of the future. In the Buddhist sense of time, Shakyamuni was born and he's the Buddha, and the religion is born, and it goes on for a very long time, but eventually that will end and everyone will forget about it. And then after a little while, someone else will be born and the cycle will start all over again. And that someone else who will be born, the Shakyamuni of their age, is Maitreya. That's why he's called the Buddha of the future. He's not technically a Buddha in our era. He's technically going to be the Buddha of the future. So that's who Maitreya is. And he does appear in art quite a bit. And almost always that I can think of, he's seated like this as a way of identifying him. The idea of including Maitreya at this cave site is interesting because some people have suggested, because there are also bodhisattvas and other stories, that perhaps the whole site was dedicated to the idea of past, present, and future Buddhas, which is an interesting way to think about it. I don't know if that's the case, but some people have suggested that. Their faces are interesting. The 6th century style is really quite different. What we're seeing is more of a developed Chinese style, where the one on the left really didn't have a style per se. It's just what they could remember from the Indian figures. And now we've had 100 years of Buddhism, and much more of a Chinese style is beginning, rounded features, etc. Yeah, Carol?
What are the holes in his hands before? He had holes, and this guy's got these nice little square holes.
Yeah.
Is there something on top of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that. I don't know whether those were added as part of some sort of restoration. I honestly don't know, and I have tried to find out what that is, and I'm just never been able to. And you see holes like that in architecture, and it has to do with restoration and things that people put so that they could access certain areas. But I don't know if that's true here. So yeah, I tend to try and not see them anymore because they frustrate me because I don't know what they are, and I wish I did. So if anybody encounters that, let me know. We're going to go back to actually a site. I think did we look at, yeah, well, I'm not sure if we looked at Dunhuang before or not. When you're teaching a class like this, and I spent earlier in the week going through all of this, and now I'm coming back to it, I live in a perpetual state of deja vu. And I can't remember whether I said it to you or whether I said it to the last time I taught the class, or whether I said it to myself 3 days ago. When, it's like, did I just talk about this? I feel like I did. Anyway, we looked at this area called the Gansu, this narrow strip, and talked about how important it was to the Han. And I think we looked at the site at Dunhuang, but I can't remember. It's a very early and important location, right where the Silk Road splits. I've mentioned before, I know how important these sites are, these sort of like trading posts, these sites that were located where people sort of come together, people speaking different languages and practicing different religions. So it was a trading post. It was a Chinese military base because it was an important site for guarding. It was a place where ideas were exchanged. It was a pilgrimage site. The Dunhuang caves are very famous. They're called the Mogao caves, but I tend to just think of them as the Dunhuang caves. And they're very old. They run all along this valley. Some of them actually go back to, there are caves there that have things in it that date back to 1000 BCE, long before there was any Buddhism or any of the other religions in the region. And in these caves, we have found a great many things, paintings, things stored. Actually, in 1900, they discovered a secret library there, a room, a cave that had been sealed off for probably since about 1000. I think it was sealed around 1000, and it held paintings, sculptures. It held a lot of texts, historical documents, copies of the sutras, Buddhist sutras. There were textiles there. It was just this incredible find, but that's the sort of thing you see in the caves. And I want to look at a painting, one painting from the Mogao cave. It's one of the most famous things from there. We'll come back a little later and look at something that is a little later, but in this, it's a scene from the Jataka tales, or the stories of the life of Shakyamuni, the previous life. It's called the Mahasattva Jataka. It's the most famous of all the stories, and we're actually going to encounter this story again later in other art, in Japanese art even. The format is interesting. It's these 3 registers or 3 levels, and you read them. The top one you read from right to left, and then the second level, you read from left to right. And then the third level is right to left again. So it zigzags, across the scene. And the story is an interesting one. And I have some details here so we can see it a little bit better. This is where it begins up here in the right. And it's a story of three brothers. One of them is Mahasattva and his two brothers, and they were princes. Stories in the Jataka tales are often about princes because it's assumed that the last state before enlightenment or rebirth as Shakyamuni was as a prince. So the idea of a prince symbolizes someone who is almost fully enlightened, a very intelligent, knowledgeable, wise, compassionate person. You're almost a Buddha. So prince showing as a prince kind of tells that story. So they're saying goodbye to their parents, the king and queen, because they're going out on a hunt. Now we see them here on horseback. The whole thing is a continuous narrative, which means that it has multiple scenes from the same story. So the same people show up over and over again at different parts of the story. So they're going out into the woods on their horseback. And then there's some animals here. You can see here they're riding through the forest and hunting. There are deer, there's tigers in the forest. And then, we turn the corner and start back, and they camp for the night. So this is their camp. And they see up on the top of a hill a tigress with her 7 little cubs, and she is starving to death. And it's shown very well here. It looks like she's about to collapse, and she's sort of drooping and doesn't have much color. And the brothers are very upset about that. So they decide to look around to try and find her some food, and they can't find anything in the area. So Mahasattva sends his 2 brothers off to go farther to look for food. But he's already got a plan in mind when he sends them off, because in the next scene, he basically just lays down in front of the tigress, and he tells her, he basically just says, eat me. He's going to sacrifice himself because she has all these 7 cubs to feed, but she won't eat him because, number one, he's alive, and she doesn't sort of eat animals that are alive. So then he goes up to the top of a cliff and he cuts his own throat and jumps off the cliff. And this is like blood flowing out. So by the time he lands at the bottom, he's dead. So then she does eat him and saves her life and her cub's life. Now, this part of the story is one where my teachers always use this as an example as to why it's important when you study Buddhism to study with a teacher, to study with a qualified teacher, because they can explain to you what this story really means. Because it would be very easy in a lot of Buddhist stories, and I think especially this one, for someone who's already sort of perhaps, disturbed in some way, to interpret this as suicide is good or whatever. And that's not what it means at all. It's not actually about killing yourself. It's about compassion. Those 3 levels, right? Everything exists on 3 levels. And that this doesn't in any way say you should sacrifice your life for anything or anyone per se, but rather it just symbolizes compassion. So when the brothers come back, now down here, the brothers come back and they find just his bones. They're of course very upset, and they go riding back to their parents here, and they tell them the story. And it's hard to see this lower section, what's going on, but they're in front of either the Buddha himself or a sculpture of the Buddha, and I don't know what's going on over here. I can't find anybody that talks about this little section. But anyway, the Buddha tells them that they should build a stupa to honor their brother's sacrifice. And so now back here, it actually ends way back here over his bones, because he tells them to build the stupa over his bones. Now remember, stupas are these Buddhist monuments that have relics inside of them. And the earliest one we saw in India had the remains of Shakyamuni Buddha. So this idea of a stupa to commemorate someone's remains makes sense. What I find most intriguing about this is the sort of progression of the scene. First of all, it's all depicted in a kind of chronology, right? It's a narrative that unfolds. It's an interesting narrative format for a painting. You know, paintings usually are a single fixed image, right? A moment in a story, as opposed to something like this, in which the narrative unfolds. This is a kind of time-based art that unfolds over time as it chronologically moves. But when we saw this side chronologically, we were supposed to sort of not see the stupa, because at that moment in chronology, when they found the bones, the stupa hadn't been built yet, right? So then they chronologically go this way, but then they jump back here because now they're, instead of a chronological structure, it's a physical structure. It's a space structure. So now instead of showing the stupa over here with the bones again, they jumped back to this spot and built the stupa. It's just a shift in thinking. The artist made a shift in terms of how they were thinking. But this is the sort of image or scene that you see on the walls in the grotto, and a very important one. Now I'm pointing out this motif because it's very reminiscent of a new painting motif that is just beginning in China at this time, and that is scrolls. Cave painting is sort of dying out, you know, the painting on cave walls. And by about 100 of the Common Era, we find a painting motif developing in China that, particularly after the arrival of Buddhism, becomes really popular, and that is painting scrolls. And there are basically two kinds of scrolls: the hand scroll and the hanging scroll. And the hand scroll format is unique. It's totally unique to East Asia. None of these are anything like Western formats for painting. And the hanging scrolls don't come along till about 600. So for about 500 years, the hand scroll is the most popular format. Also, album leaves begin, and I don't have the date on that, but album leaves are basically just loose sheets of paper. They're not bound together like a book. They're just loose sheets, but they do they come in groups, but they're basically just kept in a box. So it's loose sheets of paper in a box rather than bound. And then fans are another popular format in China. When we get to Japan, there are other kinds of formats that don't exist in China. But the hand scroll is particularly interesting for narrative. It's basically the average size of a hand scroll is they're usually around 10 inches high, maybe 12, but somewhere in that range. And they could be anywhere from 10 feet to 30 feet or 40 feet long, depending on how big a story you're telling. Some stories are so big that they take 10 or 15 hand scrolls to tell the story. And we will encounter that in Japan, not in China. The hand scroll is never completely unrolled. You'll never see it unrolled as a 30-foot scroll. It's always kept rolled, and it's rolled up on the left. You view it by holding it in your hand. So that really determines sort of the height, the size, what's comfortable. And you unroll only the amount that is, you know, reasonable, between about the width of your shoulders is what you can hold. It starts out with everything rolled up on the left, and then the scene begins on the far right of the scroll. And then as you unroll the left, you roll it up in the right. So it's a very cinematic quality. It's like film passing through the lens in a way, although you're doing it in your hands as you're moving it. Because of its format, everything in it moves from right to left. So if there's, as we will soon see, if there's people moving or walking, they're always walking from right to left, because that's how you're going to view it. You're going to see the right hand part first, and then it'll gradually move slowly to the left as things move. It's very much a time-based art, and no doubt influenced paintings like the one we just saw in the cave. I mean, if you took those three registers and put them side by side, you could tell that story in a hand scroll. It's basically how it's seen. And because it's sort of time-based, you have to think about different things when you're constructing a hand scroll. First of all, it's a very intimate art form. Only one person's ever going to look at it at a time. This is not like a big painting on the wall where 20 people can enjoy it. It's very intimate. And very personal as an art form. The way people would see them is they would be kept in boxes, and people would have what they call viewing parties, where people would come over and they bring some of their scrolls, and you'd all just pass them around and look at everybody's scrolls. I mean, it's a wonderful idea to have an art viewing party. It's just how you would see them. Let's take a look at one of them. One of the earliest and most famous scroll. This is actually a copy. We're going to pretend like this is the 4th century original. It's actually from a few hundred years later, but even given that, it's still, as a physical object, I think the oldest silk scroll that we have. It is painted on silk. Early on, silk was most popular. Later, they'll start using paper more. But at first, it's silk. That strange thing you see here at the top, that is the entire scroll if it were laid out. Someone laid the whole thing out and then photographed it. When we look at a hand scroll, we will typically only see an excerpt. At any one moment, you're looking at a little excerpt from the full scroll. In fact, it's this scene you see here is sort of right here. As you can see, they typically will, sometimes they'll have text. They'll usually have text. It'll usually alternate text and image. Sometimes, in this case, there's a lot of text at the beginning, and then all the images. As we'll see, there is some text that overlays the image, and then a whole lot more text at the back. It is based on a poem, which is the inspiration. It's called The Admonitions of the Instructress to the Court Ladies. It's basically 9 scenes, 9 individual discrete scenes that tell stories, little vignettes about very famous women from the imperial court, and I'm talking about concubines, wives of the emperor, and it's meant to be a kind of lesson used as a lesson to the new ladies entering the court. So it's the instructress admonishing them, or whoever's in charge of training these young ladies how to live in the court. They're being taught through these 9 stories of these very virtuous and very famous women of the past. So it's really a teaching story that's happening here. And there are many different lessons. Before we talk about the specific subject, as you can see, first of all, it's overly yellow. It wouldn't have been, it's aged silk. One thing you may still be able to see is there's really no space created. There's no background. There's no ground they're standing on. They're just figures floating in the air. That's very typical of at least early Chinese art like this. You can see we call this a colophon. Today, colophon means something else, but in this context, it's called a colophon. It has colophons and stamps, and we'll see more of those. Now, these sorts of things, these things that are handwritten on here, they could be a lot of different things. They could be statements from the original artist who is telling you something about the story. It could be something added later by maybe a later owner of the scroll who wants to write something down about its history or how he got it or what he thinks about it. The stamps themselves also serve different functions. The artist would certainly put, most of these are names. The artist would certainly put their name, but also later owners would put their name. Also important sort of people in the art world, important connoisseurs. Remember, these viewing parties where important people look at the scrolls. If someone feels very strongly about it and they love this, they might want to put their name on it, put their stamp on it. It's a kind of stamp of approval. The students always found this so fascinating because, in the West, you don't go writing on a work of art. You don't stamp your name on it. You don't ever do anything to change a work of art. That would destroy its value. But in Chinese art and Japanese art, that actually increases its value the more important people put their stamp on the work of art. So getting used to that takes a little effort. This particular story that you see is a story of Lady Feng, and whether these are true or not isn't really the point. Somebody could probably made these all up. But in the story, she throws herself in front of this bear. This is the emperor, and they're out somewhere, I don't know, but this bear comes up, and she puts herself between the bear and the emperor. So she is behaving in a proper manner. All of these stories reflect very strongly a Confucian sensibility, a sense of everyone knowing their place, knowing their role, knowing how they relate to everyone else, and acting in the way you are supposed to act. So this is a very Confucian act. You can also notice it's very light, it's very elegant and very sort of fluid as these elegant figures sort of float along the ground. This is sometimes referred to as a feminine style, and we'll talk more about that later. Here's another scene. I don't know what all these scenes are, but in many ways it doesn't really matter that much to us. But look at all the stamps on this particular one. It almost fills up the space with the stamps. One of the most famous stories, and I don't think it's this one, but the one that always impressed me was that an emperor in the past, he favored one of his wives over the others, and he started giving her privileges that the other women didn't have, and he offered her something, and she said no. She said, no, you can't do that. And that's a really important story, because in a Confucian sense, it shows that not even the emperor is above Confucian responsibilities, that he has to follow those rules just like everybody else. And it was inappropriate for him to do that. He should not have been offering her these things. And she knew her position. She knew what she was entitled to and what the other women were entitled to. And she stood up to the emperor and said, no, you can't do that. So that was a very important lesson to these young girls. And it also shows you why some emperors like Qin Shi Huang from last time didn't like Confucius, because he didn't like being told that he had responsibilities to people. And so that's communicated in this work as well. And in fact, wherever that scene was, what it says by it is, favor must not be abused and love must not be exclusive. That was the rule of the imperial court, and he was abusing his position. And it may be this one, I don't know, but that looks like an emperor, and it could be this is the one where she's speaking to him. Also some of those could be little poems or excerpts from the poem itself. So the admonition scroll, a very important early hand scroll. And we're going to see hand scrolls, I think, we're going to see more of them, but I honestly believe that the hand scroll as a format really comes into its own in Japanese art. And we'll talk much more about that later, but we'll see why I think that's the case. So we're still in an early period. The Great Tang Empire is the second golden age. Han was the first, Tang is the second, and in many ways, it's the most important golden age. This really was a golden age when China, the Chinese capital, the principal capital is at Chang'an, again, still where the Han capital was, and others, with a secondary capital over here at Luoyang, but Chang'an in particular. It was cultured, it was opulent, it was the epitome of exemplary government. It was also a period of expansion. This is sometimes called the International Tang, and it's International Tang. I like using that because then I can remember this is the period when China really opened up, and there were people from all over the world in China. In the capital city, you had sections of the city for different religious groups. There were Buddhists, Judaism prospered, Christianity was clearly present, it's early on, but Islam, there was an Islamic center, Zoroastrianism from Persia, all had distinct communities within the city itself. Trade was expanded. Their influence on particularly Japan during this period was profound. There were a lot of Chinese monks traveling to Japan and back and forth. The civil service exam, which had begun during the Han, the first golden age, were continued, but they become even more important in terms of your ability to advance in government. And as a golden age, it's also the golden age of these cave sites. In fact, it's kind of the height of them and the end of them all at the same time. And this is also when these, the last cave site we saw in India was during the Gupta period, the Ajanta caves, and that's sort of what's happening here. It's very similar to that, the greatest of them all, but the last of them all, and that's at the Lungmen cave site, and this is sort of one of the largest. There are over 2,000 caves and niches running along this river, and over 100,000 sculptures. It is considered, particularly this figure of the Buddha, the principal of the monumental figures, one of the greatest monuments of Tang patronage. This was supported particularly by an empress who donated a lot of money. She donated 20,000 strings of cash, and don't ask me how much that is, but it's a lot in order to finish this project. We know that it was sort of dedicated in 670, well, really 672, but I rounded it up because there's an inscription that sort of identifies the year. And we're going to take a look at the main figures. He has two sets of attendants, not just one. And I also want to look at these figures over here on the right, these guardian figures, because this is something new. Now, here's our Vairochana. This is not Shakyamuni Buddha, but Vairochana, one of the 5 transcendent Buddhas. And we saw Vairochana, the gigantic Buddha at Bamiyan in Afghanistan was a Vairochana as well. So that's who this is. He has 2 sets of bodhisattvas identified in their princely garb, but even closer in between them and him are 2 monks. And this one is identified as Ananda. Ananda was Shakyamuni. This isn't Shakyamuni, but Ananda was a cousin of Shakyamuni Buddha, and he's the man who really began the whole project of writing out all the Buddha sutras, the teachings of Shakyamuni. So he has a special role. So, but two monks on either side. The style of this is very influenced by, I think, the Gupta India style, which is this perfect, serene figure with the eyes nearly closed, sort of in deep meditation. And when you look at the face, you can see that more clearly. It's sort of, the ears are fairly crudely carved, but the rest of it is considerable detail, and it is now a fully developed Chinese style. The hair is really beautiful. It's very different from anything we saw in India in terms of how it's carved, but it's very ornate as a design. And I can't help but see it, somewhat in the context of the Gupta. This was our Sarnath Gupta Buddha figure, the height, this beautiful Chunar stone in India, just sort of the ultimate serene, peaceful, inward moment. And while this is Chinese and it's not going to have the sensuality of the Indian, the Indian is this perfect, rounded, sensual features. They're more angular in China. It's just a different style. Nonetheless, it's equivalent. It's not equal, but it's certainly equivalent in many ways. The figures on the right, however, are really different, and we've never seen them before in Chinese art. And they really show the influence of esoteric Buddhism. In other words, sort of what we saw in Tibet, the more complicated, because they're forms of their guardian figures, and they're forms of what are called sometimes called the Dharmapala, which means the Dharma protectors. They're guardians, these figures that we saw in Tibetan art that sometimes people call them, they look demonic, they look like warriors, they look dangerous. And they're meant to be, but they're guardian figures. We're certainly going to see them in Japanese art. What they are what are called the wrathful manifestations of various bodhisattvas and Buddhas. We've talked about in Tibet, all of these different Buddhas and bodhisattvas and figures, they all have many, many avatars, many forms in which they appear. Well, at least one of those forms is going to be what we call a wrathful or an angry version. And the wrathfuls are what you see here. That's the Dharmapalas, or the guardians of the Dharma, the fierce protectors. In China, they begin to take on that role of guardians and protectors. And they're really quite fierce. There's been no face like this in Chinese art before. It's the beginning of something new. This guardian seems to be holding a kind of miniature stupa in a way. But we're certainly going to see many more of these guardian figures, these wrathful figures in both Chinese and in Japanese art. The influence from India is also sometimes seen in their stance. This is we didn't look at this, but it's a Gupta Bodhisattva figure, but he's standing in that typical Indian Tribhanga pose, that 3-body bend pose, and we believe that that's what they're attempting to do here. You can actually see it even in figure like this. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a bit of a body bend here. It's more pronounced in these guys, however. One last thing from this later period from Dunhuang, and this is absolutely the last. It's one of the very last things painted in the Dunhuang caves. And it's a scene that represents Pure Land Buddhism. And we're going to be looking at a lot more art representing Pure Land. And so we need to understand what it is, not only in China, but especially in Japan. Because Pure Land Buddhism becomes the dominant Buddhist group in Japan, and it still is today. Pure Land is the largest Buddhist sect practicing there. Pure Land is really unique. It's sort of one of a kind, and it's all centers around Amitabha Buddha, one of the 5. Remember when we looked at the 5, there were 2 that were dominant. Vairochana was one, Amitabha is the other. He was associated with the West. Remember, they all have a direction, the color red, Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara. So they all, if you look back at that little table that was on the Mahayana handout, there's a little chart there that tells you about Amitabha. But they all actually have a sort of paradise that they're associated with, but the others, nobody pays that much attention to it. But a whole sect grew up around Amitabha and his Western paradise, which is called the Pure Land, or the Western Pure Land, which is the paradise of Amitabha, and it's called Sukhavati. That's the name of it. The name of this paradise is Sukhavati, and a sect grew up around that. I tell the history here. I'm not going to go through the history, but if you have the handout, and again, if you don't, just email me or something and let me know. I'll get it to you. But fairly early on, around a little after 400, a group of monks got together and decided that they thought this path, being, this is a very difficult path to enlightenment, and that it was just too hard for most people. Most people still believed at this point, even though Mahayana said others can practice Buddhism, the only real way to achieve enlightenment is like to be a monk. That was still the more important way, because you're completely dedicated to it. And they just said, this is just too hard. Not everybody can do this. So they focused on certain sutras or certain teachings, particularly the White Lotus Sutra. There's also a Sukhavati Sutra. There are several writings relating to Amitabha. But according to Pure Land Buddhism, you don't need to do all these other things. That Amitabha has accrued so much merit that he is enough for everybody, and that all you have to do is call on the name of Amitabha and you can be reborn in the Western paradise. The goal of a Pure Land Buddhist is not to reach enlightenment. It's to be reborn in the Western Pure Land. And this is amazingly similar to a Christian conception of heaven, a place where, you know, everything is great and you don't have problems and worries. The idea being, once you're in the Pure Land and you don't have all these, you know, distractions and horrible things from real life, from there, now it's easier to reach enlightenment. So they don't even try to go all the way. The Pure Land is a kind of stopover. It's a way station. It's a place where you can stop along the path, an intermediary stop on the path. And from there, then it's much easier to reach enlightenment. It's a very, in many ways, a very odd belief system within Buddhism. It's not like anything else. It is more closely related to Christianity. And people always ask about, you know, could there be influence? I don't know, you know, there certainly could be, but I don't know if there's any evidence that there is. But first of all, this idea of a heaven is not where you actually might be, as opposed to a metaphor, is really foreign to Buddhism. In general, to call on the name of Amitabha, you have a mantra you repeat over and over again. Namu Amitofo. Fo is Buddha. Namu means glory to, or something like that. And Amito is short for Amitabha. So you're just saying glory to Amitabha Buddha over and over and over again. And Pure Land monks do nothing. Talk about an earworm, you know, getting something in your head. This is all they do all day. Every minute of every day, they're saying this over and over and over again, just accruing that. We're going to talk more about this in Japan, because that's where it really catches on. And we'll see a lot more art dedicated to this belief system. But nonetheless, we do see depictions of it. And this is from the Magao caves, one of the latest, is late 8th century. When someone tries to depict the Western paradise, and we're going to see it in architecture and in other paintings, it's generally in the form of a garden. If it's anything that describes Sukhavati or the Western paradise, it's beauty. It's a beautiful place more than anything else. And in Chinese art, what defines beauty is symmetry. And we encountered it before, but you really see it here. In this case, they've really constructed a scene that mimics a kind of imperial palace. This is the architecture of the emperor. So it's like a great imperial garden surrounded by all of the bodhisattvas and others. So this is Amitabha in the center, surrounded by the Western Pure Land. And to visit this, if you're a Pure Land Buddhist, you just repeat your saying over and over again. There's in fact the second page to this handout talks about Pure Land in Japan. So I'm just going to set that aside, and we'll come back to that later when we get to Japan, because the imagery of Pure Land is going to become much richer in Japan. It's not just going to be a simple image of Amitabha sitting there. It's going to be a lot more. And then the second scroll I want to look at from the Tang is a very, very famous scroll. And that is known as the Scroll of the Emperors. And where the admonition scroll was seen as being a feminine style, it was for and about women. This is the so-called masculine style, and it's a very famous scroll, one of the most famous. It was made at the height of the Chinese figure painting. These scenes from the court, both of these deal with the imperial court. These are popular in the Tang, but within a couple hundred years or even 100 years, these are not popular subjects anymore. It's only for this early period. People don't want to necessarily only look at scenes from the imperial court. So the painting subjects are going to change quite radically by around 1000 or so. But we're still in this early period where this is exclusive. This is elite art. This is made for people in the imperial family or within the imperial court. These are not things that ordinary people would have. These are luxury goods for the very rich. When more and more we have others involved in the art world, more of a merchant class and others who can participate in the art world, they're going to want other types of seeds, different sorts of things. And we've seen this idea happening in Western art as well. We believe this was painted by, I didn't put his name here because nobody's 100% sure, but we believe this was painted by a man who served as the prime minister to the emperor at this time. We know he was a painter, a sculptor, an architect, and it's very typical of this system that, you have the academy where you study all of these things to move into the sort of political system. What they were doing were producing increasingly what we call scholar officials. These are political leaders who are highly educated, quite sophisticated, often artists and poets. It's hard for us to imagine that. That's not where our government leaders come from. In fact, they're usually pretty antagonistic to things like the arts and the humanities. But in China, they've built a system in which the rulers were supporters of the arts and creators of the arts. And so the idea of a prime minister being an important artist is not unheard of. In fact, very soon we're going to see a work that was made by an emperor who himself was a painter. What's interesting, it's a depiction of 13 past emperors. None of these are actual portraits. None of these are meant to be what the emperor looked like, because most people never saw these emperors. They don't know what they look like, and paintings of them were never trying to be portraits anyway. The first 6 were very damaged. The later 7 were in better shape. This is typical of hand scrolls. Since the way you roll them and unroll them, the section to the far right is going to get unrolled and rolled more. It's going to be seen more, it's going to age more, and generally the damage is to the right side of the scroll. So some of them sections were repainted, others we have the originals. But one thing that's true, and this is clearly an original area because it's already pretty damaged, there develops a motif for telling this story about the emperor and his attendants. The emperors are all depicted as fairly massive. They have these broad barrel chested, there's sort of a girth to them. That's a symbol. It doesn't mean they look like that at all. It's a symbol of their power, their presence. There's a very Confucian sense to this as well, in terms of how they relate to one another, which is communicated not only in their physical body types, but their scale, their relationship. We saw this in Western art, if you were with us last time, how in early, Western art, important people were presented as bigger. The bigger you are, the more important you are. And so you can see, even within the servants and advisors, there's a status, there's a hierarchy, and they relate to each other in different ways. The idea of the 2 servants holding sort of his elbows as a motif, I find this so fascinating, not only because it mimics the kind of Buddha triad where you have like a Buddha in the center and 2 attendants on the side, but you also see this in other parts of the world. In fact, this is a very popular motif in certain African art where you have the king in the middle and 2 servants on either side holding his elbows exactly like this. It's something, deep in the human psyche that's sort of triggering these motifs. But the emperor is usually a fairly stern figure. And I love these images. Now, what makes this a masculine style, I'm not saying it's masculine. What makes it what they called a masculine style was the strong line, these very strong dark lines, where the admonition scroll had very wispy, didn't have many lines at all. It was mostly sort of just translucent washes of color. Very strong line dominates here. Line is seen as masculine, and we're going to be talking more about calligraphy very soon, which is a male art form. So that link between line and masculinity develops clearly, but you can also see the motifs of that sort of stern, powerful face, the subservience of the attendants, and again, that very Confucian sensibility and how they are depicted. So another very important early scroll. When you see them side by side, you know, it's masculine versus feminine. They're both storytelling. They're both influenced by Confucian. They're both about sort of behaviors. One is teaching a lesson, the others aren't. But the admonition scroll, you don't see those thick, dark lines everywhere. It's more of a softer sort of color of brushing, which was important as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Chinese architecture unless it's an object in particular. But I did, isn't that beautiful? I just love some of these scenes in China, stunning Mount Wutai, very, very old. It's a sacred mountain in China. It's one of a handful of sacred mountains, but there are still the remains of the oldest. I think this is the oldest remaining wooden structure in China. You know, wood just doesn't last. I mean, that's the reason we don't have a lot of old wood, but the main hall from Fogguanxi Temple at Mount Wutai, important pilgrimage site. It's sacred to Manjushri, and Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom, who's depicted a lot in Chinese art and also Japanese art. As well. But I really just want to look at the timber framing, because in China, a unique way of framing a structure develops, and it's used over and over again. It's called a bracketing system. First of all, they use timber framing with vertical posts, ceramic tiles on the roof, which would be regularly replaced. But it's this bracketing system that is unique. They will do it in Japan as well. Under the influence of Chinese style, but there's really nothing comparable in the West. It's a system of interlocking, superimposed brackets using levers and lintels to redistribute weight evenly onto massive piers. And here's the system here. And there are a lot of variations of this, but it's largely a similar system, picking up all the weight and then funneling it in and in and in. It's the opposite of taking the thrust and funneling it out and out and out. You know, if you were with us when we looked at medieval art, we looked at the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and it came up with a system of pendentives in which the heavy dome was then, the weight of it, the downward thrust was filtered out on forms and then out and out, like a champagne tower with the champagne just pours out and out. Well, this is like you take that and turn it upside down, but it's a very similar system in terms of how weight is redirected onto smaller and smaller posts. And sometimes these can be very elaborately carved and very beautifully carved. They are using entirely mortise and tenon. There's no nails, there's no adhesive or fasteners of any kind. They're just cut perfectly, which is really the best way to do it, which means which is probably why the building still stands, because, you know, it can give, it can move, and in earthquakes or whatever, there's movement there. It's not so rigid that it would break or crack. So as a structure, we're going to see this in more and more buildings, usually richly painted and richly decorated. And the last thing I'm going to look at in Tong is the ceramics. Now, this is a place where this is a topic where the Nelson Gallery could help us out a lot. For whatever reason, and it's always interesting, the history of a museum is, how do they end up with this collection? How is it that you have all these things in this area and nothing in this area? I mean, all museums are like that. And the Nelson has a good Asian collection, but their ceramics are outstanding, and particularly their Tong ceramics are outstanding. And I don't know how they managed to do that. They have some of the, not only Tong, but Sung and other periods, phenomenal ceramics collection. And it's becoming an industry. It's just starting during the Tang. There's a northern group of kilns and southern. It's the southern kilns that really will go on to be the center. When I say industry, I don't mean like big factories. What I mean, this would still be hundreds and hundreds of small kiln sites next to one another for miles up and down this riverbed. Altogether, they're an industry, but they're really just independent little family-owned kilns making these things. Look, I'm going to look at something from the north, but it's really the south where ceramics develops. Well, actually, this is from the southern kiln site, U-ware collection. I want to say a few things about ceramics because we're going to be looking at more of it, and some of you know a lot about ceramics and some of you probably don't. Briefly talked when we looked at that Neolithic pot, I briefly mentioned like earthenware and stoneware and porcelain, but I want to sort of repeat that again. Earthenware is low fire ceramics. The kiln doesn't get very hot and only gets up to about 900 Celsius. It's a very porous clay because it isn't very hot. So you have to glaze it if you want it to be watertight because it's porous. It's typically the kind of ware that would be, you know, sort of peasant ware, or in everyday homes, you'd have earthenware. Higher fire kilns will create stoneware, which is not quite porcelain, but it goes up to 1200 degrees centigrade. It's much less porous. Some stoneware doesn't really even have to be glazed, but typically it is. There are different definitions of that temperature. Europe has one definition for porcelain and China has another. If it's over 1280, we're getting into the porcelain range. The first true porcelain comes from the Tang Dynasty. This is a vase that in one context might be called stoneware, in another context might be called porcelain. It's a little tricky when you're, you know, studying something like this and you're reading about this vase in one book and it calls it stoneware, and in another book calls it porcelain, and you're wondering, well, which is it? Well, it depends, you know, those are just labels, and people use different ways of defining those labels. In China, it would be porcelain. In the US, no, it's stoneware. But anyway, to make true porcelain, which this is right on, you know, you could call this porcelain and you wouldn't be completely wrong. To be true porcelain, it's based on the clay that you use. You have to use what's called a porcelainous clay, or kaolin is the typical clay. It's a white clay, a special clay for porcelain. And most importantly, and then they often add things to it like feldspar or other kinds of silica materials added to the clay. So a certain kind of clay, and then fired to a certain temperature. And the big problem with porcelain for the next few hundred years is at the temperatures you need to turn it into porcelain, to get that glaze to coalesce with the clay body and turn into basically glass. At those temperatures, it's almost impossible to hold on to color. It's like you have to choose. You can only have bright colors in earthenware or maybe low fire stoneware, but if you're going to make it as hot as you need for porcelain, then the colors are going to burn out. You're going to get that. So that's the big search. How do I get bright colors in porcelain? And they will figure it out a little later. So the most popular colors during this period for early porcelain are the celadon glazes. So this is a celadon. U-ware. U is usually the name is a reference to the kiln site where it was made. So as you can see, this is related to the kiln site, Shangyu. It's called U-ware, so it tells you where it was made. And the celadon is the color. Celadon is a kind of, can vary, but it's a bluish to greenish glaze. And it was very, very popular at this time. It was popular because it was associated with jade, or the colors of jade. These vases were highly valued and highly prized, and therefore quite rare. Also, tea, the drinking of tea was very popular at this time. And a book in the 8th century, the Chajing, a book, very, very famous book on tea, was published in the 8th century. And in that book, the author specifically said that these celadon tea bowls were the best to use for drinking tea. And we'll be talking about tea more when we get to Japan, because that's where tea really becomes an art form more so than in China. But certainly this popularity of these celadon glazes is definitely related to the importance of tea. Other things that come into play in ceramics are things like not only the clay chemistry itself, the chemistry of the clay, the chemistry of the glaze, the kiln temperature, as I've already said, but also the kiln environment. Chinese kilns were 2-chamber kilns. You'd have one chamber where you would have your fuel, which would either be charcoal or wood, depending. If you don't need it to be too hot, you can use charcoal. But if you need it to be really, really hot, you need a wood fire. So one chamber would have the fuel, and then a separate chamber would have the pots in it. And it's not always like that. Sometimes you could use one chamber and have both in there. The value of 2-chamber is that you can control the oxygen level in the chamber with the pots. And so you can change the color of the vase or object by either letting in oxygen or removing oxygen. It's called an oxygenating environment or a reduction environment. And for this ewer, which uses copper and iron-based glazes, the copper glaze is turning green, while the iron is turning red. And this is because oxygen is let in, and we know that copper and iron will oxygenate, and it's turned rust, and copper turns green. So you can control the colors by the use of oxygen. This ewer is particularly interesting. It's not really a very Chinese shape. It's actually clearly being based on Islamic metal work. This is the sort of thing you'd see in the Middle East in metal ewers like this. Now it's being created in China. Silk Road's wide open. This is international Tang. People are coming and going back and forth. So you're seeing these sort of cross-cultural forms here in work like this. So it's a complicated process to create colors like this. This is earthenware. Notice low fire, bright colors. You couldn't get these colors if you got that kiln too much hotter. So again, they're somewhat limited in terms of what they can create, but this is basically a 3-color glaze that has some lead in it. Lead makes things pour. When we were talking about bronze work, I talked about them adding lead because the bronze pours better. Lead makes things flow in interesting ways. So lead has been added. And, lest you think they're all similar, I mean, all sorts of things are happening. Here's a beautiful stoneware jar with handles. And it has what's called the tea dust glaze. And that's because this glaze is reminiscent of the sort of powdery dust of tea with an unglazed foot, as some kilns will have. So next time you go to the Nelson, take a look at their Tang ceramics. They have just lots of beautiful stuff. Also this, I mean, you can't miss these. There's practically a whole room of these in the Nelson Gallery. And it's one of my favorite places because I love these 2 models. These are ceramics, again, but they're earthenware. They're just low fire earthenware. So they have color, but beautiful colors in them. But these are molded and mass produced. These were made literally by pressing clay into molds. So these are sort of like factory made things, and they're directly associated with the Tang because of these sort of unique forms and shapes. The Tang horses, there's nothing like Tang horses. Look at the ones in the Nelson, they're stunning. They have, these large bodies with tiny heads and legs, and it's a unique design. Now, they're called tomb models because you would basically just go to the shop and buy them for people's tombs. People would find these in tombs. And they're also so very Tang in their international quality. There's an exotic quality to many of these. Many of these show foreigners. This one on the right, this camel, these are the caravans, right, going up and down the Silk Road. These are foreigners. I think they're supposed to be like a Turkish musicians or something. They're clearly not Chinese, but it's this sort of exotic foreigners. And the city itself, of course, was full of people like this, these wonderful Bactrian two-hump camels coming from what is Afghanistan today. So beautiful pieces. I love these Tang ceramics. These weren't like expensive or elite because they're sort of mass produced, but nonetheless, they're very much of a moment in time, and they tell you a lot about that moment in time.
So in this room at the Nelson with these amazing things, there's also some little figures of small, funny looking people. And they're described, one sign will describe them as dwarfs, and another sign will describe them as demons. Do you know anything about them or what I'm talking about?
I don't actually, I can't see them right now, but the terminology is the same. It's used in Hinduism for that. Shiva Nataraja is dancing on the dwarf or the demon of ignorance, so it makes me think it's something like that. They symbolize like Mara, or the opposite of enlightenment. They symbolize the little things in your life that keep you from attaining what you want to attain. That's what it sounds like. I'm going to go look them up. Are they in a case?
No, I think they're sort of out there with these, with the, pretty prominent, like, in the center of the room. I think it's just sort of right as you walk in the door, you kind of can't miss them. But I was frustrated by the contradiction.
Well, dwarf is a common word interchanged with demon. So it doesn't mean what it means in the West. So yeah, I'm going to look those up. I don't know why I can't place them at the moment. Okay. Okay, let's move on. Looks like most people are back. Okay, so we're right at the end of the Tang. The Tang was this long period of, sort of enlightened government and good things happening, but right at the end, its last, say, 50, 75 years, things are falling apart, and it's much less enlightened and much more restrictive. What you get is an emperor who began persecutions of Buddhist temples and Buddhist sites and monasteries. He based that on, he said there was a conflict with Confucianism, that Buddhism conflicted with the ideals of Confucianism in the sense of civic responsibility. These are the same issues that Shakyamuni faced when he first established a monastic system in India, this idea that it's irresponsible. Men have a responsibility. They're supposed to be householders. They're supposed to have families, and therefore monks are irresponsible. That's a common argument that comes up in India when you want an excuse to close down Buddhist sites. He was really much more afraid of the politics of religion, and we've seen it before. We'll definitely see it in Japan. The same thing happens. A kind of fear that these religious leaders are going to get too powerful. For whatever reason, there's a persecution of Buddhism, a lot of destruction of sites, of shrines, temples, monasteries. About 60,000 monks and nuns were forced to go home and join sort of society. The the only place that really survived was Dunhuang, and that was largely because of where it was located. And by that time, it was actually under the control of the Tibetans. You know, it's right out there close to Tibet, and they protected those cave sites. So that's why there are so few remaining Buddhist caves from that period. But we are moving on now, and I'm going to get a good start into the Song. You know, everything we've looked at up to this point through the Tang is really considered early. Beginning with the Song, we're moving into a later era. I'm not going to call it modern, but the Song is an important dynasty. It's sometimes just called one dynasty, or divided into two: the northern Song and followed by the southern Song. You can see on the map, early on, they controlled all of this area, the capital at Kaifeng, and then 1127, the Jin people from the north, basically Manchurians, pushed south and conquered this region. The court fled south to Hangzhou, which became the new capital. So that identifies what's called the Southern Song. So the Northern Song before they're pushed south. And there is a difference. I mean, it's fair to say they are two different dynasties because in terms of art forms, it changes somewhat. Interestingly, the Chinese disparage this period. They see the Song dynasty as sort of a low point in Chinese history. And there are reasons for that, which you will see later as we get closer to the end of the dynasty. I personally see it as, it's my personal favorite of all of the periods. It's also the period that is most influential on Japan. The Japanese will look to the Song for their inspiration. And they're not wrong. In many ways, it's the least Chinese period. It really does vary from what we think of as traditional Chinese. It's why the Chinese don't like it. It's why the Japanese do like it. It's probably why I like their work. They're also going to be seen as weak by later dynasties. And we'll see why. There are a couple of reasons why they're seen as weak. There is a great growth of education, a great, the beginning of a merchant class, that really a merchant class builds to this time. During this time, their children finally have access to civil service examinations. It is the most open that system has been thus far. As a pathway to growth. It's a period when publishing begins, 500 years before the West has a printing press. Every single time I hear somebody say the printing press was invented in the 16th century, I want to scream, because it wasn't. It was invented in China 500 years before that. It was only invented in Europe in the 16th century. Europeans didn't have it, but the Chinese had it 500 years earlier. So with printing comes a growth in scholarship, in literary practices. It was a very efficient and well-governed period. It was the most sophisticated period, which is one reason why it's going to be seen later as weak in some ways. The tastes were begin to be less aristocratic. We find with this new merchant class and more educated people, demands for things other than simply the scenes of the court life. Daoism is going to have a huge influence. Prior to this, Confucianism dominated, particularly in the sense of court scenes, because they were very much about how everyone's sort of sense of order. But Daoism is going to draw attention more to nature and the order of nature as opposed to the order within a social structure. It's also going to really be the age when Chan Buddhism comes to the fore. And Chan is known in Japan as Zen, but it originates in China as Chan. It's the simplest of all the forms of Buddhism. And it's the handout is here. If there is a spectrum of Buddhist practices, on one extreme end is Tibetan Buddhism, which is the most steeped in ritual and symbolism and figures and everything. On the extreme opposite of that is Chan. It has nothing. It has no text. it's basically completely minimal. And it's really about one thing. It's about a direct perception of reality, and particularly nature. I use several examples in the handout, which I won't necessarily go through, but it's more about, instead of being about our attachment to many different things, as Buddhism generally was, as we talked about before, Chan will focus on our attachment to conceptualizations, a tendency to conceptualize. It's, in fact, the word simply means meditation. That's all it is. It's meditation Buddhism. It's about one thing. You don't need anything. You don't need stories or images or books. You just need you, sit down, meditate. That's it. That's Chan, that's Zen. It doesn't need to be any more than that. Now, what I mean by conceptualizations are the things our mind does that keep us from simply experiencing what is happening right now. The story in here, of course, that is usually told is the story of Kashyapa, the story where Buddha said to, you picked a flower, turning it in his hand, and then one of his disciples, Kashyapa, who's usually considered the founder of the Chan sensibility, simply saw the flower and smiled, devoid of conceptualizations. Conceptualizations are when you pick up a flower and you go, oh, that's a rose. I really like roses, but I prefer the white ones. I used to have them in my garden, but that was when somebody lived next door. Well, it's the story, why can't you just look at this thing and be? Why do we have to have stories? Why do we have to label it and categorize it and pigeonhole it and decide whether we like it or don't like it? That's what we do with everything in our world. If we could relate to the world without telling ourselves stories, that's conceptualization. Also, in meditation, we encounter that a lot, interacting with people. We talk about, one of the stories is I used to tell is like, if you're out sort of walking down the street and you see someone walking toward you, that you start inventing stories. You start going, oh God, I should have called him yesterday. He's going to be mad because I didn't do this. And before this person gets to you, you've worked yourself up into some frenzy about what's going to happen when you speak. It's because your mind is focusing on the future and not focusing on now. But if you stop conceptualizing and just interact with that person at that moment in time, then you'll have a genuine interaction with them, as opposed to focusing on the past and focusing on the future. Here's what happened before, here's what's going to happen in the future. The essence of meditation is to be now and only now. So that's the essence of Chan. There are no texts or rituals. Basically the goal of Chan is not to reach enlightenment. It's, well, sort of it is, but more importantly, it's about satori, or these little moments of insight. It's about just little moments where you look at the flower and smile, where you don't have a story. Those are moments of insight. It's a small idea, but it's actually a very big idea in many ways. And we're going to see how that affects art in directly and indirectly. Now, also very influential on art in the Song is calligraphy. These are the four treasures, the four most important things relating to calligraphy: the ink, stone, paper, and brush. And they're called the four treasures. And calligraphy's been gaining in importance. We've seen it before. It begins when Chen Wang codifies the ideograms. I already mentioned when we looked at the Scroll of the Emperors, how it affects the idea of line in art and the importance of line. All of the master painters of the Song dynasties are calligraphers. It's actually considered a higher art form than painting. So to be a calligrapher is a necessity to being a painter, because this is where you learn the marks, all the different marks that you can make and then translate into painting. Let's talk about this new kind of painting style. When there are no longer a desire for images of court life, and when Chan Buddhism is drawing, when Daoism is drawing your attention to nature and balance, it gave birth to landscape art in China. Landscape painting in the West doesn't really begin until the 17th century. In China, it begins right around 1000 in the early or the northern Song period, and new kinds of ways of working develop. Now, this is a hanging scroll. Hanging scrolls began around 600. These are scrolls just like hand scrolls. In other words, it's silk. There are two dowels, one at the top, one at the bottom, and you can sort of roll them up and put them away and change them out whenever you want to. So it is a scroll. It's using a material or a technique called shimo. Shimo is ink using ink wash. Shimo literally means ink and water. It's ink wash. When we think of Chinese painting, we don't think of color. We don't really think of color. It's basically ink wash painting. This is the beginning of traditional Chinese painting style. And it's a beginning of what we call the literati. And this is a whole new sort of class within the art world. This artist, Fan Quan, was a hermit painter. Hermit painters were very common, monk painters, hermit painters. There were different places where painting could be made. There were court painters. Oh, Angie, did you have something?
Hey, just a little tidbit on the ink and water. It's actually shui mo, not shui. Yeah, SHUI. Shui for water, mo for ink.
Okay, moi is moi.
Mo. MO is, yeah, MO is correct. That's for ink. And then shui is SHUI for water.
Okay, I wanted to say moi. I have been told that I pronounce every language with a French accent.
Oh, you know,
I don't know.
It doesn't matter. I just saw that. I'm like, sure, Mo. No. Anyway.
Sure, moi.
So it's shui, SHUI.
SHUI, like feng shui. But I usually see that written that way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly like feng shui, which is wind, water.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We will come to, well, actually, we'll come to that right now because that's completely relevant to what we see. It's impossible to separate a painting like this from geomancy, which is, geomancy is basically sort of power within the physical world itself, the magic of the earth itself, and the energy of the qi that flows through the water. We're going to see that with architecture as well. The ideal way to place a building is with a mountain behind you, which would be the north, and you want the building to face south. So that's the ideal setting. And you want water to run in front of it. That creates sort of the ideal physical energy that you want around a structure. And anyone seeing this would know how to read this image in that way. There is meant to be a river down there. You see the mist rising from the river. You don't see the river, but you see a waterfall, and you see that there is mist rising. So there's a river running in front of this. Now, the sources for art during this time, you would have court painters who would be painting at the court for the imperial court and others. And in fact, it won't, well, I'm not going to say it because it hasn't happened yet. We'll talk about it in a minute. But right now, court painters, they're going to paint in a little more colorful way and different kinds of subjects. You're going to have professional painters who basically sell their art, and they could sell it to the court or they could sell it to anybody else. And then you have this new group known as the literati, and they come from people like hermits. They might be scholar officials. They might be monks. But what identifies them is their independence and their stance as independence. They never sell their art. They see themselves as free and independent and therefore uncorrupted by anyone else. Now, the literati will develop as an oppositional voice. At this point, they're only oppositional to court art because they hate color. They hate all these bright colors. That's not seen as sophisticated. It's not seen as artistic. Black and white, or nearly black and white, is considered the highest art form, the more sophisticated art form. And so we'll talk. Can you hear that? I think that's, can you guys hear that beeping? I hope that's not alarms going off somewhere.
I hear it. I don't know whose it is.
It's
Carol
definitely here. It's coming through my speaker, but I can't tell what it is. Okay, it stopped. Maybe it's outside. Anyway, what we've got is what's a work called monumental. In the monumental mode, several modes or styles develop. In the monumental mode, it's fairly obvious what that means. Now, there is a very strong Confucian aspect to this work, in that the mountain is said to symbolize the emperor, while the foothills symbolize other officials surrounding him. So there are symbols there. So let's take a look at what we've got. This incredible landscape, first of all, that is influenced by the actual topography in this northern part of China, which is quite stunning as an geological design. But also influenced by this sort of Taoist sense of symbiotic relationship to the natural world. You have figures, little travelers down here. They're very tiny. You can barely see them in the full image, but they're down here. And of course, they're traveling from right to left because that's how a hand scroll has people traveling. It's what people were used to in imagery. Fan Quan was a very well-known calligrapher, and you see the importance of line here. This is all about each of these individual lines. In fact, they tended to develop specialties of certain sorts of marks that were specialties for them. Here's some more detail. You can see there's typically a monastery up here in the mountains that you just get to see the roof lines of it. There are little things happening everywhere that you want to look at in detail and draw you in. In terms of the sense of space, it's an interesting perspective or point of view in that it sort of travels with you. You know, where are you, the viewer, looking at this scene? Are you on top of another mountain? Are you hovering in the air? The simple fact is your point of view changes. You seem to be looking straight across, but as you look up, you're looking straight across at all of it, as if you're physically rising with the piece to view it that way. Now, while this is influenced by specific topography, it is in no way a depiction of an actual place of any kind. This isn't how you worked in Chinese art. Experience is about a collection of views and ideas that then you put together in your own unique way to tell a particular story here. So the story and the message is very much a Taoist message and also a Confucian message in terms of the depiction. The role of the literati is growing in importance. And as I said, their oppositional voice will become more important. They often wrote poetry. They were always calligraphers. And most importantly, they took great pride in the fact that they were not trained artists. Their amateur status was an important part of who they were because that helped identify their independence. Here's another painting in this same mode, where again we have this symbiotic relationship with the natural world. Yeah.
How big are these paintings?
Well, this one is quite big. I didn't put the dimensions down there. It's probably 10 foot high. It's an unusually large hanging scroll. They're generally not that large. This one I don't have the dimensions on, so I'm not really sure, but it's definitely much smaller than that. So these are not gigantic. The Nelson Gallery has an incredible collection of scrolls, Chinese scrolls, and none of them are on display. There are a couple of really late things on display, but they have some beautiful, really early pieces that are, in storage. And I don't know why. Maybe they're just too delicate to put out. There could be reasons, but they do have a collection. If you look at the catalog, you'll see some of the most incredible pieces. They have something that's very similar to that Fan Quan. In this one, we can see some little figures down here. They often have like travelers or fishermen or sometimes little artists. When this artist wrote about his painting, he talked about the fact that he meant the mountain to refer to the emperor, the foothills, the advisors, the trees were the great lords surrounding them, and the noblemen, etc. So he specifically stated what it signified to him. So there's usually a little path that will draw your eye in and then will lead you back and around and up the mountains. The second to the last emperor of the Northern Song did establish the first Imperial Painting Academy. Now, the academy I've been talking about was purely one to study Confucianism and other things. But now this is a painting academy because the emperors loved art so much. But they were teaching in an institutional style that was popular with the court. Oh, I forgot I had another little detail here of this thing. The style that was taught in the Imperial Painting Academy was in the literal mode. They liked more detail. Literal mode refers to the kind of accuracy and detail that you see here. In fact, this is a very famous painting, and it was painted by the emperor himself, Emperor Huizong, who was a very well-known artist. And it's painting a subject that becomes very popular throughout Chinese art, and that is the bird and flower theme. So lots of birds, and especially at court. Court art will have a lot of bird and flower paintings. For one thing, it allows them color. I mean, this is what the literati were responding against, were things like this bright red color. This animosity to color, or this sense that black and white is somehow better and purer, appears in art in many different times and places. It takes different forms. The argument was there in Western art in the 18th century. I think it's at the root. Angie knows more about this, but I can remember very clearly when I first started teaching in a studio department, you did black and white photography. For a long time, black and white photography was considered the only real art photography, right? There's a long tradition for that. And art programs, we don't want to get into color, because I can remember when the program started doing color, and it's controversial. It's like, oh, that's what snapshots are color. Color is common, there's something base and common about color. And it's usually linked to emotion. It's usually linked to the idea that color is emotional, where black and white in whatever form is seen to be more intellectual, and therefore it's treated as more sophisticated. And there's something about that even in this debate here between sort of color in art versus the literati, who see themselves as more pure. The other thing I want to say about the literati is this stance that they take about, being proud that they don't sell their art, and that they're unique individuals. Much of the argument of the literati parallels almost exactly the rise of the avant-garde in the West. I mean, the stance of the avant-garde in the 19th and 20th centuries in the West was rooted in this idea of being independent, and nobody likes my art. That means it's really good because I'm independent and you just don't understand what I'm doing. There's a bit of that sensibility of being avant-garde, within the stance of the literati. So we're going to see the literati develop because the literati within the next dynasty is going to become much more political. They're not that political. They're not oppositional to the political leaders here. They're only oppositional to the kind of art they like. But they will very soon be oppositional to the politics of what is happening. Piece of architecture we have to talk about briefly. And that is the pagoda. I mean, you can't look at Chinese or Japanese art without talking about the origins of the pagoda and what that means. This is folklore Xiu, which means Buddha's palace pagoda. And you can see there's another building with it. Originally, this would have been within a monastery. Pagoda, and this is the building itself. It's hard to see what you're looking at because it's hard to see the scale. See this little tiny guy down here? It's made difficult by the fact that it appears to be 5 stories high. It's actually much bigger than that. It's 216 feet tall. It has 5 exterior stories, and then inside, there are 4 more stories in between each of those in the form of a mezzanine around the building, that around the interior. A pagoda is a stupa. It's the Chinese version of a stupa. And here's how they develop. You know, the first stupa we looked at, this is a Buddhist building, the function of which is to hold holy relics, and they principally are meant to remind you of, first of all, the life and death of Shakyamuni Buddha. So they're associated with commemorating death, but at the same time holding various holy relics. So we saw them first as a simple mound, and we didn't see later Indian stupas. Well, actually, that's not true. We saw Indian stupas, small ones, inside of Chatai halls. Remember those cave-like Chatai halls that had a small stupa at the back? Well, those were the ones we saw, 3 of them, and the later ones were on sort of pedestals like this, getting taller. So this is the second phase. We did see what happened in Tibet, where they turned into what were called chortens, which is Tibetan for a stupa, and they were very symbolic and complicated mandalas. Now, when they entered China, they actually merged with a uniquely Chinese type of structure called the Han Watchtower. And this is a model of a Han Watchtower. There are 2 models of Han Watchtowers in the Nelson Gallery. They look very much like this. This isn't the same one, but they have these. They're maybe 5 foot tall. They're in cases in the Nelson Gallery. They're clay models. A watchtower was a very specific kind of structure. Pretty self-explanatory. Every town had them. They were watchtowers. You know, they stood at the gateway to the city and where guards were inside. So when the Indian pagoda or stupa merges with the Han Watchtower, you get, first of all, the typical Chinese stone pagoda. So it looks more like a watchtower. And it's also when the idea of the stupa takes on more of a role of protection. You know, the idea of protection was connected to the watchtower in the Han. And so now these new stone pagodas also, they're still what stupas were, but in addition to that, they're also protection. And then the one on the far right says Japanese wooden stupa, but the simple fact is there are Chinese wooden pagodas as well. We will see them in Japan, but this is a typical sort of wooden. They're very complicated and very large buildings. They're primarily empty. I mean, this is basically walk inside and it's a huge open space. The levels above are mezzanines that you walk around. You've all seen those hotel interiors where they have the big sort of atrium in the middle, and then all the floors of the rooms, you know, circle on balconies. So it's this big open space. It's sort of like that. And there would be sculpture in them, sculpture inside of them. They're not generally, they're not temples or not places of worship, but they are places where they're in a monastery. So where a monk would go and perhaps circumambulate sculptures of the Buddha, etc. So that's an early role of the pagoda. And we're going to see pagodas in Japan as well. And I think yeah, I don't want to talk about that today. It's too late. Let's stop for today, and we'll start next time with our most famous Northern Song piece in the Nelson Gallery. And then we will move on from there and see what happens when they move south. So questions, comments, discussion, anything, anybody. And remember, I can't see you, so just jump in and say something, and then I'll be able to see you.
It's really interesting, Peggy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it's pretty interesting too.
It is. It is.
Can't wait to talk about this guy, but I
Oh.
don't want to rush him. Don't want to rush it.
Is this painting that's we're looking at right now, is it inside of a pagoda?
No, this is in the Nelson Gallery. It's a sculpture.
Or was it?
It's a wooden sculpture. It's in the Nelson Gallery inside of a reconstructed Chinese temple. The big walls all around it are the reconstruction of it. Not the temple it was actually in. They don't relate to one another. But no, this is in the Nelson.
Do we know where it came from?
Specifically where? No.
Ah,
I don't know where like it was found or where it was housed. I'm not sure when it came here. It's a beautiful piece.
it's a beautiful piece.
Yeah, it's over life size. It's well over life size.
Oh,
So we will talk about Kuan Yin next time. Any other questions or? Yes,
I just
I can't.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now. Yes.
I will have a whole new appreciation for this part of the Nelson now.
Yeah. Go up there. When you can get there, go up and look. It'll
like
be.
Look at it. I never understood it, but now I think I have a whole new appreciation. Thank you.
Yes, I agree.
You're welcome. Well, I don't see how anybody can appreciate anything in a museum if you don't know, if you don't know something about it. It's just a thing because, some people think of art as like timeless and we should be able to relate to it, but that's not my belief. I don't believe art's timeless. It's very much grounded in a moment in time. And if you want to have a real understanding, you need to know what was happening and why it is what it is. But, there are different ways to look at art. I'm a historian, so to me, it's grounded in history. Can't help it.
if this statue is wood, how is it preserved? Because you talked about wood being so fragile, but it's just so gorgeous. What do you think they did to keep it preserved?
Well, at first it's painted. And they would have kept it painted. I mean, paint doesn't last on wood. I mean, they paint buildings, but then if you allow that, you know how it is. Everybody's got a house, knows how this goes, right? When the paint starts peeling off, the wood starts going. But if you keep it up and you keep that paint on there, a protective layer, and obviously this was well taken care of. There are some pieces that simply weren't well taken care of and some pieces that were. And this was obviously precious, well taken care of. It was kept out of humidity. If it's in a humid place, it's going to be destroyed very quickly. The paint would have been kept fresh. So there are ways to preserve things if you, are conscious of it and try. And if you don't, they're just gone. But absolutely, the conditions are incredible and unusual. Okay, well, we'll just call it a day then. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and we'll pick it up where we left off next week and move forward and find out more about why the Chinese don't like this period.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.